Buenas tardes. Welcome. Bienvenidos to our conference center, Fronteridades Lecture. I'm Javier Duran, Director of the Conference Center for Caribbean Inquiry and Professor of Latin American Border Studies. We are really excited to have you, see you all here, attending this important lecture and dialogue tonight about the experiences and lives of migrant children. Childhood is a theme many times overlooked when we talk about migration. Our speakers will touch on the stories of migrant and refugee children, children of deportees, their experiences, the legislation and policies that affect them, and the cultural and literary production on them. This work captured in the book, which many of you have, Children Crossing Borders, Latin American Migrant Childhoods, constitutes a much-needed effort to analyze and learn about different modalities of childhoods in transit and their ensuing challenges. Tonight, we are delighted to host this wonderful panel of experts, Dr. Irasema Coronado, Dr. Alejandra Josiowicz, and Marissa Bejarano-Fernbaugh. The Fronteridades Lecture Series started in 2019 as a way to bring emerging and established border scholars with interdisciplinary theoretical expertise to help us understand transborder dynamics from multiple locations in a more nuanced way. I'm also proud to say that all of the lecture presenters have been women of color. This lecture series, supported by the Mellon Foundation, aims to highlight the underrepresented voices of border scholars, artists, and organizers. Thank you for being here and participating in this conversation with us. I take this opportunity to thank our presenters, the University of Arizona Press, El Antojo Poblano, our colleagues from ENR2 and Facilities Management, whose labor will keep this place clean after we leave. And my deepest thanks to the Conference Center team, whose amazing energy makes these events possible and successful. Please a round of applause for the Conference Center team. Muchas gracias. And also, join us later after the lecture for some refreshments and delicious food from El Antojo Poblano. This is going to be outside on that side of the building. And also, we're going to have a book signing with Dr. Coronado. And many of you, everybody, I hope has a copy. If not, please request one. Our Q&A is open through the QR codes. You can scan on your program using your phone camera or type in the link in your browser. And feel free to drop in your question at any point during the lecture, and we'll get to it during the Q&A. There is also an option in which you can vote for the questions you want to answer. And of course, if you prefer to write down your question, please raise your hand and a staff member will provide you with an index card to write the question. And so the Conference Center has also a series of events. We call it Show and Tell, happens downtown. And our next event is titled Mujeres del Agave. It's going to be on Friday, April 28th at the Mexican American Heritage and History Museum, Sosa Carrillo House, downtown, in collaboration with the Tucson Agave Festival. It's going to be a great event, and we hope to see many of you there. And I understand there's going to be a mezcal tasting, so that might be of interest to many people. But this is an amazing lineup of women doing a lot of work within the industry and also about the production of agave products in Mexico and beyond. Follow us on social media. And also with that, it's now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our colleagues who are going to be speaking tonight. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Irasema Coronado, who is a professor and director of the School of Transborder Studies at ASU. And her research focuses on the politics of the US-Mexico border region, focusing on binational cooperation, activism, human rights, environmental issues, and the role of women in politics. She's co-author of Fronteras No Más, Towards Social Justice at the US-Mexico border, and numerous academic articles. She's also a member of the Association for Borderland Studies and the International Political Science Association. And I have to say that she's been a trusted and valued colleague for many years, and also complice in many academic adventures. And I can say that we started our academic career together back in the day as grad students in this university, going to a conference in UT Austin. And a week before the conference was going to happen, one of my mentors and beloved professors, Chuck Taylor, who's here, sitting in the back, Chuck, thank you for being here, pretty much destroyed my paper before my conference. So as you can imagine, my confidence wasn't that high, but I managed to pull an argument and do a decent job at the University of Texas and Austin grad students conference in Latin American Studies. So it's been a pleasure working with Irasema over the years and to have her here tonight. And we also, I just want to mention that anecdote because it's been a while. And so it's really, we're delighted that she's back in Arizona. So the other speaker is Marissa Bejarano-Fernbaugh, is an AL educator, activist, and advocate in South Louisiana, a Mexican-American who grew up in the United States-Mexico border town of Nogales, Arizona. She received her BA in political science from the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas, and her MED in curriculum and instruction with a concentration in English as a second language from Louisiana State University Shreveport. Marissa's passion for creating equity and inclusiveness for all her students and her low education compelled her to continue her work on behalf of immigrant and English language learning populations. And our third speaker is Dr. Alejandra Josiowicz. Is Profesora Adjunta, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Languages and Literatures of the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She's also Prociencia Fellow and Joven Cientista do Nosso Estado. She's currently studying feminist and anti-racist activism on Twitter in Latin America. She has published on Latin American studies, gender literature, and childhood studies. She's the author of La Cruzada de los Niños, Intelectuales, Infancia y Modernidad Literaria en América Latina, and author of numerous academic articles. She's a member of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and participates in the 2022-2023 cohort of the Latin American Hub, LAC, of the Feminist IE Research Network. And with that, I want to welcome Irasema, who's going to lead the conversation here. And a round of applause. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate your presence. Bienvenida.
Wow, I am so happy to be here. You have no idea how delighted I am to be here. Good afternoon, muy buenas tardes. Thank you all for being here. This is my alma mater. I love the U of A. The U of A has been very good to me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the importance of the U of A as I continue in my comments tonight. Javier, muchas gracias. We've been through a lot. We fought at this university. We fought with the administration. We got all kinds of accommodations for minority students. And that was because you were such a great leader and you still are today. So thank you. And I want to thank yes, of course. I want to thank your team. Iram, Yasmin, Angela, Diego, Yadira, Valeria, Maria, Michelle, for your support in bringing us together, because I know these things take a lot of effort, the technology, that the PowerPoint stuff works. I mean, this is just wonderful. So I want to thank you for your hard work in making us sure that we're all here together. The U of A deserves a lot of credit for this book, and I'll tell you why. A very esteemed professor of mine, Dr. Donna Guy, a history professor, we took the class together, introduced me to Alejandra. Alejandra Josiowicz is really was the leader of this book. And she and Dr. Guy were working together, and Dr. Guy was focused on other projects. And she said, let me introduce you to Irasema, and you guys can work together and bring this book to fruition. And that is why Donna Guy, who was a wonderful professor of ours for many years, was really the catalyst that led to the beginning of this book. So that's very important. The other people we need to thank are the University of Arizona Press, especially Kirsten Buckles. Kirsten immediately gravitated towards the project. She loved what we offered. She really kept us in line, meeting the deadlines, making sure we had good production team. And so it's been a wonderful pleasure to work with the U of A Press and especially with Kirsten. And we're even more delighted now because you will know that the book is now open access, which is something that I have been fighting for a lot in my academic career. So this book is very important because it focuses on immigrant children and borders. And, you know, the US has a lot of work to do in this area. And, you know, on the one hand, we need workers. And I'm going to give you a quote by Marty Walsh. She spoke at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland in January of 2023. And this is what he said. I'm going to quote to you what he said. "We need immigration reform in America. America has always been a country that has depended on immigration. Right now, we don't have a good immigration policy. There are jobs available right now in the US that we don't have enough people for. The threat to the American economy long-term is not inflation, it's about immigration. It's not having enough workers." Again, in January, Alejandro Mayorkas, who is head of Department of Homeland Security, also made a very interesting announcement. And he basically said that the Department of Homeland Security was going to start an expedited immigration process that will allow immigrants exploited in the workplace or involved in labor investigations to apply for protections from deportation and for work permits. He went on to say that the US wanted to protect workplace conditions and the US labor market and the dignity of workers who power our economy. I quote to you, "Unscrupulous employers who prey on the vulnerability of non-citizen workers harm all workers and disadvantage businesses who play by the rules. We will hold these predatory actors accountable by encouraging all workers to assert their rights, report violations they have suffered or observed, and cooperate in labor standards investigations." Then, I think this month, March the 3rd, no, well, we're starting March the 3rd, the New York Times wrote one of the reporters wrote a great piece on the growth of migrant child labor in all 50 states. Children who have been crossing the southern border without their parents in record numbers since 2021 are ending up by the thousands and punishing jobs that flout child labor laws. That was in the New York Times. We live in a country that needs cheap labor to do dirty, dangerous, and demanding work, including immigrant children. So that is why I think this book is so important, because we really touch on the migration of children in the Americas. And now I'm going to take a seat and I'm going to turn it over to my, and by the way, I have to say something. Alejandra and I have never met in person. We did this through Zoom. We did this through email. It's amazing how it worked and we got it done. So I have great affinity and great affection, great respect for Alejandra. And I'm so happy that she's able to join us tonight from Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. So I'm so grateful to everyone here. First of all, to the organizers of this fantastic event. That I'm so jealous that I can't be there with you tonight. But in a way, I am there with you. So thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this talk at Fronteridades. And of course, thank you, Irasema. So Irasema has been my great companion in this journey. And everyone at Arizona State University and also at Arizona State University Press has been a really fantastic journey. So I will not mention everyone because Irasema has already mentioned some people, but I want to say that as frequently in book publication, there have been many reviewers and also the collaborative dynamic that we have built with authors. It was so nice. I mean, so encouraging to see women, women of color working together in the US and in Latin America, talking different languages and about different topics, but collaborating together to find a way to talk about this topic that it's so important for us, right? So I will tell you a little bit about the journey. So Irasema said something about it, and I'll tell you my perspective and my story. So I worked I published a book on Latin American children, and that has been for many years my topic of research and interest. And so I have always thought that this idea of dividing Latin American children or dividing children in general, actually, because in the US something similar happens when not all children are granted the rights of being a child, and so the category of the child in itself it's unequal, is unfair, and not all children are treated as such, protected as such. So with that question in mind, I talked to Professor Donaray, that has also, as Irasema mentioned, taught for many years at Arizona University, and she suggested that I focus particularly on children on the borders. And she also connected me with Professor Irasema Coronado. So for me, at that point, was discovering a very interesting area of research and of inquiry, and also meeting Irasema, who has been an incredible companion, as I said, because I learned so much from her strength. It's so difficult, as you probably know, in academia to find an equilibrium between, our profession and the demands of our profession, and also the quality, or like a human quality, right? To be generous, to recognize what other people do, to be able to collaborate together. So I really have to recognize that Irasema has been an example for me as an academic and also as a person in that sense. So again, Irasema gave the book a tremendous impulse, and we see this book together as a combination of border studies and childhood studies, because we wanted to reflect specifically on the challenges of Latin American migrant children. So from the beginning, we wanted to provide a toolbox, and here maybe we can share the presentation. So what can we offer? We thought, what can we offer for those thinking in between border studies and childhood studies? So we wanted to share tools, what to do, for example, in the classroom, as Marissa shows very, very profoundly in her chapter. How can we think of like Latin American literature and childhood migration? What can we offer as tools for people that are dealing with migrant children, but also with children in general, and want to talk about migration? Another important point that we wanted to underscore, and that for me is very important, as I said, is the persistence of an exclusionary view of childhood, right? In which only some young peoples are considered worth protecting, worth taking care of, seen as innocent and pure, while others are deemed potential threats, stigmatized, as if they were in need of management. And in that sense, we from the beginning thought that that is not new, right? That although child migration has been a more important, has been a topic that has been given more light and attention in recent years, this idea of an exclusionary view of childhood has a long history in Latin America. And this is what we wanted to stress, the idea of that this exclusion has to do with the long history of imperialism, social, racial, and gender inequalities in Latin America. And that even though different conventions and declarations throughout the 20th century have affirmed the rights, views, and status of all children, there still persists racialization, stigmatization, and exclusion that distort and corrupt the image of many children that do not fit in the hegemonic model of childhood, right? So in a way, we wanted to show how the challenges that migrant children face today have to do with the history of exclusion in Latin America, that also enable us to see migrant children maybe as similar to other children that not necessarily are migrant, but that are also discriminated against and excluded in Latin America. Another point that was important for us in writing and organizing this book was the importance of considering refugee and immigrant children as autonomous agents. This is very important for childhood studies as a field right now, right? Because sometimes they are independent children migrants that cross borders on their own, and how in their singularities they are participants in society instead of seeing them as purely passive, right? And in need of protection. So many of the chapters show this. Valentina Glockner-Fachetti's chapter, for example, show how children in themselves decide to make these journeys, right? And how they're not necessarily always victims. So we saw how children's experiences as migrants were capable of questioning hegemonic ideas of childhood, as well as of nationality and citizenship. So many of the chapters also show how children are able to negotiate between identities in the border of different identities, and how they don't necessarily identify themselves with crystallized identities of Brazilian or not, or American or Mexican. And this is why in my chapter, for example, Gloria Anzaldúa is so important, because she shows how children are able to negotiate these identities, these different identities, right? Like she did in her book, Borderlands, La Frontera. So in times of rising xenophobia and prejudice, we also wanted to help professionals and public policymakers working with migrant children in their search for belonging, rights, and citizenship, making our educational institutions and societies more inclusive. And there are also chapters that help and that show how social workers work with migrant children, and how they work with them in these struggles for finding their identities, and because it's a process, right? Their identities, like ours, are not crystallized, right? So to start concluding, intersectionality and decolonial theory were very important as theoretical approaches that we decided to take in this book, because they helped us think how race, class, gender, geopolitics, and age are interconnected when thinking of refugee and migrant children. Because language, ability, age, geopolitical position are so important for thinking about the challenges that these children face. So the last point that I wanted to make is precisely about the collective dynamic of this book. Because it is profoundly interdisciplinary, we come from different academic backgrounds, and because we are spread among different Latin American countries, we have people from Brazil, from Argentina, from the US, from Mexico. We wanted to give more visibility to knowledge production, theorization, and research done in the South. And this is why, and particularly by Latin American and Latino women academic and researchers. And this is what you can see in this book, right? Professor Donagai, in her research, she highlighted how women since the 19th century were worried about, the well-being of children in the Americas. And we see that until today, right? Because when we wanted to organize this book, only female authors appear, right? Thinking and considering and reflecting on children migrants. So women are, and I don't necessarily think this is stigmatizing for these women that to be worried about children. On the contrary, I think women are at this point, women academics, women professors, sometimes women activists are thinking about this, that maybe are the most important things to consider right now, right? What is happening with these children? What is happening with these childhoods that migrate? And so this is why we say in the introduction, and I really believe that this book has a variety of accents. It has accents. So for some academics, it might sound, not so, I don't know, we met some difficulties at the beginning, and precisely because of that, because of the diversity of this book. But I'm so happy with the result, and with the fact that with Irasema's confidence, we persisted with this project, not maybe not fitting in a hegemonic model of how to do academia. So we persisted with this dream, and we produced this result that I'm very, very proud of. This is why we assume the cost of dissenting and producing ways of doing research and theory with different accents and from the South. Because we come from various linguistic backgrounds, native Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English speakers, diverse academic disciplines, and share a common interest in the well-being of children. So again, thank you so much. Thank you also, Marissa, in representation of all the contributors of the volume. Thank you. I give the floor to Marissa now. Thank you so much.
Hello. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. Thank you, Alejandra. First, I want to thank Irasema and Alejandra for inviting me to contribute to this important work. A lot of times, us in the trenches, teachers, we kind of feel like we're disconnected from academia, and the fact that they reached out and they wanted to share our voice as well, I think is very important. And I also feel that it makes this book so comprehensive, because you get every aspect of what it's like for a newcomer that's coming to this country, from the time they leave their country to arriving to the border to ending up in a state like mine in Louisiana. I would also like to express my gratitude to all of you that are here today. Your presence is crucial in helping us raise awareness about the significant challenges that my students face. So I'm very grateful that all of you are listening and that you're here, and I can't wait to hear your questions. Like they said, my name is Marissa Bejarano-Fernbaugh. I teach in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, which is a small area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. When I first started teaching in Louisiana, I had about 200 ESL students, mostly from Mexico, and most of them were here because of Hurricane Katrina. We had a huge influx of students arrive after Hurricane Katrina. We had a lot of people coming from Mexico and Central America. And Louisiana was there with open arms, because we wanted people to come and help us restore New Orleans and all the other cities that were devastated by Hurricane Katrina and Rita. But the schools were not prepared. They were not prepared for the influx of students that we were receiving. Like I said, when I first started, I had about 200, mostly from Mexico. Most of them had prior education. And we had a few, Vietnamese, Chinese, but not so many, but mostly from Central America and South America. And we were not prepared for them. And one of the things that we're facing right now is that we're having so many SIVE students. I don't know if you guys are familiar with students with interrupted formal education. And there's a statistic that I want to share with you that has just recently come out. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as of June 2021, there were 82.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, including 26.4 million refugees, 48 million internally displaced persons, and 4.1 asylum seekers. So that number was 82.4. 1 year later, June 16, 2022, the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide increased to 89.3 million. So from 82 to 89. This is the highest number ever recorded. And I think the most shocking part about this number is that 40% of these people are children. And so I think a lot of people, especially in Louisiana, they think, oh, Hurricane Katrina is over. We just had the terrible flooding. That's over. They think that all of these people are going to go back to their countries. And that might be true for Mexico, but it's not true for other countries. And so we are getting more and more students, and it's overwhelming. When I started 8 years ago, 200 students, there were 3 teachers. We thought that was overwhelming. Now we have over 1,000 students. We have ESL teachers right now that are not ESL certified, don't speak another language. They're just winging it, and we're taking them because we don't have anybody else. And so I think it's something different for like students that go to Arizona, Arizona being a border town. I grew up in a border town in Nogales, Arizona. So I remember we had a whole ESL department. We had an ESL program. The schools had their own student government, and everybody spoke their native language. They received lots of resources and help, and they could graduate from high school. In Louisiana, we don't have that. This is what they call an English-only state. We currently don't even have any leadership in the Department of Education for ESL. And so we are really winging it. And so being able to contribute this chapter was so meaningful for me, but also for my students, because they got to participate. And I get to see their success stories now and to see what's become of them. Some of them want to be teachers. And my chapter focuses mostly on how we became successful, which is that we created together an after-school program called Be the Buffalo. And our after-school program really started because the kids were kind of being chismosos. They wanted to stay after school and hang out and gossip and do a little bit of homework. And from that, we ended up getting a coffee machine, and it got bigger and bigger. And the kids would sit there and support each other and be like, oh, you have Mr. Garci? Oh, he's terrible. Let me tell you how to work with him. You have to talk about his children. If you talk about his children, you'll pass his class. You know, they gave each other advice. And then from there, we were able to do things like get them to go to homecoming, get them to try out for sport. I became like the personal taxi of everything because we don't have transportation. And I don't know what it's like in Arizona, but ESL teachers in Louisiana, real estate at school is very terrible for us. I have a tiny, tiny office. I have kids that sit on the floor. At one point, we'd have to sit in the hallways. And so, but we become a family, and we protect each other, and we take care of each other. Being in the South, especially during the Trump era, was very difficult as well. We had many students that were discriminated against, mistreated by teachers. And of course, every teacher thinks every student is Mexican. That's the big one. Everybody's Mexican. They don't understand that there's different countries that exist. But so we're educating. And part of that is getting the teachers to really see our students for who they are, to understand their background. And so I have to be nice to a lot of people that I don't necessarily want to be nice to, but as they say in the South, bless their hearts. You know, I work hard at speaking their language, and the kids speak for themselves. I think once the teachers really get to know them, they really embrace them and they stop seeing them. And this is what I teach at the largest high school in Louisiana. And we have a motto called Every Griffin. And so when my teacher says, oh, well, that kid's not going to make it, I'll say, every Griffin, you know, they can do it. And you see the coaches and you see the teachers, they kind of have a change of heart. But getting them to participate in sports, that's one of the things that I wrote about in the book, is getting them to participate, to not put themselves, because our students are also very good at otherness, making themselves other, as far as they don't want to really participate with the gringos, or they don't want to join the club because se van a burlar de mí, they're going to make fun of my accent. And so getting them to be brave, because I'm like, you guys came here, most of my students walked here, took them 2 months to get here. I'm like, you guys are the most courageous kids in the world. You can go and join the Interact Club. You can join soccer. If you can do that, you can do anything. And letting them see themselves as heroes of their own journey. And my best advice to them, especially when it comes to school, is don't let a piece of paper determine what you're going to do. Because a lot of them will say, I don't want to take that class because I can't go to college. I don't want to take that because I can't go to college. And so my goal is to make sure that every opportunity is available to them. And so we go for it. And sometimes it's disappointing. They don't have the documentation to necessarily go to school here in Louisiana, but we look for other opportunities for them in other places. I know Arizona is a little bit different. I think they can go to school there without documentation. But here it's just a little bit different. We don't have the same support. And so So yeah, there's a lot. Also, I wanted to let you guys know one of the other challenges that we have is that our students do not, when they graduate, they have to pass LEAP exams, and those LEAP exams are in U.S. history, biology, English, algebra, geometry. All of these exams they have to take in English. They are armed with a word-to-word dictionary and extended time. And if they do not pass these exams, they have to pass 3 out of the 6. If they don't pass them, they do not graduate. And so with our SCIF students that are coming in from Central and South America, those of them that are SCIF students that haven't been to school since 5th, 6th grade, I have some that can't count by 10. They can't even write in Spanish. And they arrive here at 17 years of age. It's very difficult for them to decide to stay in school. So last year we had 100% of my students graduate. My ESL students graduated from high school. But this year has not been a banner year for us. I've had a lot of kids drop out this year, a lot of them choosing to work. And there's no accountability. Nobody's looking for them. Nobody's saying they shouldn't be working, they have to be in school. Legally, they're supposed to be in school. But there's no accountability. There's nobody going to their homes. There's no immigration lawyer making sure that they're staying there, or somebody from immigration making them sign a piece of paper that they're in school, nothing. And so that is also a big challenge that we're facing right now. We currently proposed to our BESI board a pathway for our students so that if they stayed in school and passed all of their classes and reached their English proficiency level, to allow them to graduate like everybody else. Because it's very disheartening for them to stay here knowing that they can't, especially if they just arrived. And one of the BESI board members, that's our statewide Board of Education, they said, well, they didn't think it was fair that they could graduate without speaking English. And what they don't realize is that that's illegal. You cannot use their lack of language proficiency to not graduate. And so it's definitely an uphill battle, but we're making it. And it's the students and their families, and it's us collaborating with them. I reach out every single parent, I contact them personally. Anytime I have a situation with my student, I don't just rely on the teacher or the student. I put them together in a room and I make us come up with a consensus of what is happening. And I will go pick them up from home if they miss school. But it's an uphill battle. And so I'm looking forward to answering your questions if you have any.
Thank you. Okay, so let me share with you. Can you hear me? Let me share with you the chapters that our contributors also wrote. And thank you, Alejandra and Marissa. Can we go to the next slide? So the chapter by Kathleen Tasselaski deals with children in the state of Zacatecas who were children of deportees. Many of them were born in the United States, had never been to Mexico, but because of the deportation ended up back with their parents in Zacatecas. And her research looks at the linguistic and cultural border in this context. Marissa's chapter she talked about. Marta's chapter is very similar to Kathleen's, except she works in the state of Oaxaca. And there she talks about the children who are having a hard time. They miss the middle school in Los Angeles. They miss the high school in Denver. They were going to go to the prom. They were playing American football. And because of the deportation that their parents experienced, they're now in Oaxaca, and some of them don't like it. She talks a lot about them not knowing Mexican history, not knowing El Saludo a la Bandera, not knowing the Mexican national anthem. And they felt that that was an extremely harsh reality for them. And many of them, they're saying, the minute I can, I'm going to go back to the United States. The next slide, please. Thank you. Alejandra talked about her chapter on children's literature. Elizabeth Vallée and Nancy Bouchard are in Quebec. And they did a project with a school looking at borders. And they started with a book called Le Mur, which is The Wall. It deals with the Palestine-Israeli conflict, but then they took it to how can they learn about borders and how can they learn about other children in this context. So it is a privileged school in Quebec, but they had a great exhibit at a conference that I attended, and it really talked about how children were being socialized to learning about the plight of immigrants. Valentina's work is actually in Nogales, Sonora. Valentina did some work in a children's detention center, and she did artwork. And basically through this art methodology, the children talking about some of the trauma that they experienced crossing the border. She also worked with teenagers that had been used as smugglers, that had been exploited, that had been treated very badly, and had done this many times. And her work is very important. And there's artwork in the book that highlights Valentina's research there. Next. Patricia Nabuco Martuccelli looks at the best interest of the child, which is a UN principle that we all should embrace when dealing with policies regarding children. And Patricia looks at Brazilian policy in granting refugee status to children. One of the most touching chapters, well, all of them are touching, but the one by Lina and Emily Ruels Navarro. Lina is a migrant. She is an immigrant. She came as a teenager herself. And Lina is a volunteer in a shelter, as is Emily. And they worked with young children. They became advocates. And so they would work with these young people. They would get to know them. They would help them prepare for their immigration hearing. And they also describe how unfair it is and the rules that they have to follow when they're interacting with the children. They cannot touch them. They cannot take their personal information. And the hardship that they describe is we don't know what happened to many of them, because you would come back the next week or the next month and these kids would be gone. And they were saying, well, what happened to Juanito? What happened to Teresita? Well, they're gone and we don't know where they are and we don't know what happened to them. And, work with, Jesusita, who's the one you're working with now. And they describe that process and they're still doing that work in the Midwest. My chapter deals with children of deportees in the US-Mexico border. I did research in Nogales, Tijuana, and Ciudad Juarez, and I worked with young children and their families who had been deported. And again, the best interest of the child principle, the United States does not embrace. And many of these young people, again, they miss their schools in the US, they wish they could be back here. And one of the things that I advocate for these children is for them to be allowed to cross the border and come to school in the United States, because they want to, and they're US citizens. And so why can't school districts facilitate this process? I interviewed school officials, I interviewed DHS officials, and they basically said, well, no one under 10 should cross the border. And I'm like, well, what if there's a tutor? What if there's a parent? What if there's a person who's paid to, to move these children back and forth? It would be beneficial. Many of them struggle. I also talk a lot about preparing for deportation, which is something that a lot of our families have a hard time doing, because if the children do not have dual citizenship, once they're in Mexico, they cannot go to public schools. The Mexican government says you have to be a Mexican to enter a public school. If you don't have the citizenship, you have to go to a private school, and that can be very expensive. And so we talk about the support of the consulates in this regard. And when you get dual citizenship in the US, it's only $14. If you try doing it from Mexico, it's very expensive. You need lawyers, you need an apostille. It's very complicated. And so I feel that both the US and Mexico should have better policies in dealing with children that are on the border and use the best principle, the best interest of the child principle. The last chapter is by Maria Inés, and Maria Inés looks at Bolivian children who work in Argentina. And many of them do this on their own volition. They want to work, they want to contribute to their families. And many of them, of course, are treated badly, they're exploited, and they have a very hard time with immigration officials in Argentina. And so it's a very gripping chapter, but it's something that I think we all need to do. Okay. So, and you can go ahead. These are all just slides of, more details of what people did in their chapters. But we do hope that at the end of the day, that we make recommendations to teachers, to policymakers, and to anyone working in this space, that you can make a difference in the life of a child, and we need to be more compassionate, more understanding, and understand that our country needs immigration reform to ensure that we treat everyone with dignity and respect. And so I know many of you here work in that space. Many of you volunteer. Many of you are activists in that community. And I thank you for that, because we need lots of people working to move the needle and make things better for our children, because they are the future. And it's something that we need to try to improve their quality of life as infants and as children, so that they can be happy, productive adults. So I want to conclude. I want to thank you again for everything. And I'm so glad that you all have copies of the book. That's very generous of Javier and his center. And I'm very happy to see all of you. Maybe we can engage in conversation now. And thank you again. And if you want to direct questions to Alejandra and Marissa, you can do so. Okay.
Stay here because there are questions. And so the app, we'll go to the questions in the app first. And if there are questions here, we can also take that. So there is one question. It says, do you think this type of publications could change policies or people's perceptions of the border and migrants? If so, how? That's one question.
Well, I think reading some of the challenges that some of the families endure. So let me give you an example of one of the stories in my chapter. It is a young man who's about maybe 25 years old. He came to the United States as a child, and he lived like an American. And because of SB 1070, he was deported, and he found himself in Nogales, Sonora, and he was in shock. He's like, I don't speak Spanish very well. I've never been here. I don't have any family. He had a wife, and he had 2 children. And he was like, I need to get back to help my kids. To make a long story short, the wife got into all kinds of legal trouble, lost the children. The children ended up in foster care, and he was trying very hard to get his children. Imagine trying to negotiate that from Nogales, Sonora, with a judge in Northern Arizona, trying to figure this out. And, the foster parents were good people, because the foster parents kept communication with him, and they wanted to be, to help the reunification of the family. The judge required him to have a 3-bedroom home, because he said, you're the father, you have 1 bedroom. Because of the age difference in the children, you have to have 1 bedroom for 1 child, another bedroom for another child. And here he is making $5 a day at a maquiladora. How can he ever do that? And he was like, I want my kids. And the volunteers at the Kino Border Institute were the ones who would bring little packages, he would write notes to his children. He would send them little gifts. They would mail them from Nogales, Arizona to Northern Arizona for them to have that contact with their father. So if that stuff doesn't break your heart, I don't know. I do hope that we have people. I'm inspired and I'm hopeful sometimes, because now I'm meeting people in DHS who are saying, oh, that was my cousin. Not all my family's legal, and so I'm hoping that makes a difference. And I just met a woman the other day in Los Angeles, and she has money, and she is going to help immigrants run for office. That's her PAC. Her PAC is going to be people, you cannot be born in the US. You have to be a US citizen, but if you're going to run for office, she's like, I'm going to support you. And she's saying, I want for them to be immigrants so that they can go change things. So those are the things that give me hope. But do I think people read these things and, hopefully someone will have a change of heart and we'll have a change of policy. But we've been working on these things for a long, long time. And do we see the needle move? Not really.
Thank you. And since we have
Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. Sorry.
It's okay.
This is
Um,
awkward. This is
There's a question for Marissa. Could you please speak more about the otherness you mentioned? What do you think is the remedy to that?
The otherness. Oh, well, I was just talking about this with my husband earlier. I think so. So one of the things we did differently this year was Be the Buffalo. And I do want to talk about a little bit as to why we named it Be the Buffalo. The students named it. And there's a famous quote. I don't know if anybody knows it, by Wilma Mankiller. She was the first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And I use this as a writing prompt for my students. And Wilma Mankiller said one time how the cows run away from the storm while the buffalo charge directly towards it, and they get through it quicker. And she says, whenever I'm confronted with a tough challenge, I do not prolong the torment, I become the buffalo. And so all the kids had to write about the prompt, what it meant to them. And at the same time, one of our kids needed to pass one of the state tests to graduate. And we were waiting on his scores, and he was so scared he just wanted to drop out. And so everybody was like, "Ándale, tienes que ser el búfalo, be the buffalo." And so that's what contributed to them choosing that name when we started our club. But to answer their question, I'm sorry, what was the question again?
the othering.
The otherness.
The otherness. Okay, so one of the things is they wouldn't go to homecoming, they wouldn't participate. And one of the things we did differently with the club is that this year I thought it would be great to have English speakers, kids that are in mainstream classes, to come and volunteer their time. Instead of me helping everybody with algebra, they would come and participate. And I thought that they were going to build all these relationships really quickly with the students, and they shut down. And to them, it was like, no, esto es para nosotros. This is our time. They didn't feel like they would understand where they came from. And also I would notice, when the other kids would complain about how, oh, I have to pay for my own car insurance, or they just got a $600 dress to go to the prom. For my students, they couldn't relate to that conversation. And so it's really about finding common ground for them. There's a few students, I think, with sports that has really helped, especially with soccer and the World Cup. I allowed them to watch the game in my class. And so I became very popular at the high school amongst a lot of students that they wanted to stop by and watch the game. But that did help tear down some walls. But it's almost, I remember being the same way too from Nogales. When we would go to Tucson or go to Phoenix and go to a nice restaurant, it would be like, oh no, we don't go there. We don't go to those restaurants. But also sometimes it's because other people they give us the otherness, like we used to separate the ESL students in other buildings. And so I think that contributes to it. But it's just teenagers, I believe, are teenagers, no matter where they come from. And I do notice that, the otherness has come down a little, like my Muslim students and my Hispanic students. They have such an interesting relationship with each other. This just recently happened where my student from Pakistan, my Hispanic students, we hug each other, and they went up and hugged him, and and I'm like, you guys, you shouldn't hug, because I've seen Tat told us that's part of his culture not to. And he's like, oh, Miss Marissa, I'm not the Taliban. So, and now he accepts the hugs and the kisses on the cheek. But so the otherness is something that I think we all do when we don't feel comfortable, we don't have a sense of belonging. And so it's important to create those opportunities for them to have that.
Thank you. There's another question here. It says, please talk about the young boys ages 8 to 10 or so who have to step up to be the lead of the family, translating for their mothers without language skills, taking care of younger siblings, etc.
That happens way too often, and it's very embarrassing for the parents. It's embarrassing for the students. ASU has a lot of DACA students, and we have a lot of undocumented students as well. And this is something that the students share, especially in the School of Transborder Studies, because we deal with a lot of these things. And it's embarrassing for them to go to the gynecologist, for them to try to negotiate with the electricity company about my parents can't pay the bill. They remember that. And the other thing, if someone needs a dissertation topic, I have one for you. The impact of SB 1070 on young people. That particular generation, I just met a student who said, I went hiking in Camelback Mountain for the first time, like a couple of years ago. And I said, well, why didn't you go? You grew up here. It's a free thing to do. And he said, because my father and my mother never let us go anywhere except school and work, school and work. And we were not allowed to go anywhere so that we would not put ourselves at risk and end up being deported. And I thought, what a shame. Can you imagine that kind of life? And he's not the only one. It is very common. SB 1070 did a lot of damage to this generation that are now our university students. It really did. And someone needs to do some research on there. I mean, I would do it, but I've got too many other projects, but we have a lot of graduate students that can definitely do that. But that has definitely marked them for life.
Another question here says, what are the biggest challenges working with vulnerable individuals?
The emotional labor. The emotional labor. When I was doing the work with the deportees, many of them would talk about, I never imagined this would happen to me. The trauma, the not knowing, especially some of the mothers. There's a group in Tijuana that a lady by the name of Yolanda Varona has organized, Madres de los Dreamers, because they're like, I'm here in Tijuana, I got deported. My 2 teenage sons are in Fresno. My 2 teenage kids are in, Imperial Valley. What's going to happen to them? And that trauma and that they're afraid, they can't do anything. It's horrible. I mean, and dealing with them and you're like, well, thank you for sharing your story. And, I felt terrible sometimes that I could do nothing. And some of them feel, if I tell you my story, you're going to go change things, right? And I'm like, oh my God, if I could, I would, but it's hard, but it's very painful work. And if you're not ready for this kind of emotional labor, don't do this work, because it could be, there were nights when I would not sleep well because I'm like, oh my God, these poor kids, or these poor parents or these poor mothers. Yeah. Also a lot of kids, who, I remember the other work I did was with veterans, and that's one thing Joe Biden did do. He allowed the veterans to come back, but I did a whole project with veterans in Ciudad Juarez, and that was devastating work for me because they were like, hey, you get me, sister, right? I'm like, yeah, I get you. I developed a bond with these guys. They looked forward to my visits. They had served in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. They defended this country, and yet they were deported. And one of them, he's back now, but one of them said, yo me sentía gabacho, yo pensé que era gringo. And said when he was picked up and, that the immigration guy was like, dude, I have to deport you. But he said, tell me more about when your father came. Tell me more about when your mother came. Tell me more about, and he was trying to find some way to allow him to stay. And he said, I can't. And he said, he hugged me and he said, I want to thank you for your service. And I'm sorry I have to do this. And that to me, we had a conference at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez with the veterans, and that guy cried. And, this is a Marine guy, and when he shared his story, he cried. I'm very thankful that the Biden administration is allowing some of them to come back, and he's back. So this guy is good, but not all of them are. And so, that to me, that kind of work, I thought, what an injustice. You take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, and and this guy, and most of them, it was drug, alcohol, because of the trauma of the war, they got cut up, they got picked up, and they got deported. How unfair is that? So.
And I think with that, you also address a question about trauma in
Yes.
both different ways, for the children and also for the adults. So
yes, and I think Marissa talks about the trauma because you're right in your chapter. You talk about the trauma that the students go through and not being able to.
Well, because they have different reactions when they first arrive, to school. You have the students that, they're just happy to be here. They have a roof over their head. They have air conditioning. They have food. The last thing they want to think about is their U.S. history, writing constructed responses. They're just like, we made it. I get to rest. And And one of the things, one of the first things I asked them, what is it you want to do? Where do you see yourself in the future? And just asking a question like that, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Their reaction was so, I had one student, he was like, I've never thought about that. He never thought about where he wanted to live, what kind of house, what kind of job, what kind of clothes did he see himself wearing? I said, do you wake up in the morning? What are you eating for breakfast? Are you driving a truck? Are you driving? And it just gave him a little smile, to kind of go like, I can think about these things now. But then you have those that all of a sudden they have time to think, and it opens a lot of wounds that, when you're just surviving, you don't have time to think about those things. And when you can finally rest, even though you're worrying about, living in the shadows, that seems easy to what some of them have to live through in their own countries, or what they went through just getting over here. The trauma comes up, and like, for example, we don't have a Spanish speaking counselor for them. A lot of my students can't go to the doctor because they don't have health insurance. And so they have to miss school, and then I have to go beg my principals to excuse their attendance because, they don't get the medical excuses like other students. And also sometimes we don't have that support, but they might need a day where they just need to not be in class and sit with me. And I give them that space and that time because they need it. But trauma has impacted them, and it doesn't allow their brain to learn. They don't get to think about other things because of that trauma.
No, it is.
Thank you. Does anybody want to ask a question here directly? Okay. I mean, the app is great, but.
Gracias. Muchas gracias por todo su trabajo y todo su labor. I have a quick question. Has anyone researched the role of the U.S. Office of Refugee and Resettlement, and also the shelters of unaccompanied minors, for example, local shelters here, on the education and the well-being of the minors? Or if that's something, a research that is in the future.
But it's hard to do, and they don't give you access. That is the problem. And so I think the civil society needs to start asking what kind of education. In some facilities in Texas, the University of Texas at Austin Law School did work there in the Hutton Institute, in the Hutton Detention Center, which was not feeding the children, would not buy toys for the children. It was hot, it was cold. They were giving them very inexpensive meals. There was abuse, and that professor was able to raise awareness and bring about some change. But this for-profit detention is horrible. And it's something that we all need to be made aware of, because they do live under horrible conditions, and some of them are there for months. And so how do we fix that? But it's the access, and they do not let you in. I tried to enter some shelters in El Paso, but you have to have some credential. Are you a spiritual leader? Are you a religious leader? Are you a psychologist? Are you a social worker? But being they're like, no, we're not going to let you in. So that access. One of the ways, indirect ways, is to get people who work there to then tell you, but it has to be anonymous, because many of them don't want to share their names because of retaliation. Yeah, and some of them, like Lena and Emily, saying, they were the only Spanish speakers in some instances, right? And so how can you engage with someone who's little? See, and I couldn't do what they do because I would be too tempted to hug a little kid, and then they throw me out, Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question here, and I think you alluded to this in your remarks about the New York Times report.
Yeah.
That there have been many children lost under the current administration in response to public uproar and pressures to release children with no review.
It's horrible. I mean, and and these are reputable companies. It's not like, the little restaurant down the street. I mean, this is like Kellogg's and the people that make the granola bars. I mean, that's horrible. And she got a lot of publicity and she got a lot of interviews, but where do we take it, and where are our officials enforcing those laws? How do these kids even get to work there?
Well, and also, if I can say, Governor Huckabee in Arkansas just passed a bill lowering the age and the requirements for students because they want immigrant children to work in those companies. And there's nobody challenging this.
Yeah, no, the dirty, dangerous, demanding jobs of this country, the immigrants are doing.
And there's another question, and this is, what do you find most inspiring or hopeful in the process of putting this book together?
It's one person that can make a difference. You know, I always tell my students the story of the hummingbird, that, you know, the forest is on fire, the animals are running for their lives, and the lion and the hummingbird are running in tandem. And the lion says, "Hummingbird, what are you doing? You know, you're going to get burned here." And he said, "I'm getting water to try to put out the fire." And he said, "Well, how much water can you possibly carry in that little beak?" He said, "Hey, I'm doing my part." And so I think that's what we can do. We can all do one little part. Some people can donate money, some people can run for office, some people can write a book, some people can work in a shelter, some people can be a teacher, some people can, you know, make all kinds of changes, right? But we all have to do our part to make this better, you know, and not everyone can do the emotional labor. That I can tell you is for sure, because it can be extremely taxing on a person.
And I think this is also connected in terms of, says, how do you deal with learning and presenting sensitive information about the children for this book?
Well, we did it, but a lot of it are pseudonyms. A lot of it was very painful. I mean, some of the chapters, like Emily's chapter and Lina's chapter, and the chapter in Nogales, Sonora, is very painful because it also, the drug smugglers were taking advantage of these kids to serve, you know, to help them cross drugs into the United States. And so it is very painful work.
Are there any questions here from our folks in the audience? Use this.
I'm curious what kind of promotional or like press resources you have to get this in front of people who are decision makers or other teachers who maybe could use the inspiration that maybe Marissa might provide, or others who contributed to the book.
Well, we're presenting the book and we're hoping to do workshops, and, you know, I mean, I never miss an opportunity to speak to policymakers. Some policymakers do get it, but they're like, you know, right now is not the right climate to introduce immigration reform. I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, this country is very hypocritical. I mean, when, you know, Biden's Secretary of Labor went to, you know, Davos and made that statement, where was the press? And he's saying, you know, the biggest issue is we don't have enough workers. And there are a lot of people wanting here to come to work, you know, so we're very hypocritical about our immigration policy for sure. But I wish that we could amplify this and, you know, get some change. But and I hope that in 10 years, we're not having the same conversation. You know what I mean? I mean, we had a conversation with the DACA students, because DACA is now 20 years old. And they were saying, you know, we're now adults. We're no longer 7 years old. Some of us are married. Some of us are essential workers. Some of us have kids, and we're still in this limbo. And that's an easy fix. Cinema could do that, and so could Mark Kelly. Have they? And many of our students worked for them. They canvassed for them. They made phone calls for them. And they're like, why haven't they done a thing to help us? And I think that's egregious. That's unconscionable.
On a smaller scale, for me, one of the things I did was I gave the book to my administrators. And I think it's funny because they wanted to read it because they thought they were in it, you know, their pseudonyms and everything. And they wanted to see if they were in the book. And so I've had a really good response actually from a couple of the principals. I'm at a really big school, and so we have about 6 principals. And there's one in particular, because he knows the students, and he didn't realize all of their stories, and he didn't realize all of the struggles that we had to get there. And so now that I'm fighting to get a classroom, I don't have an actual classroom. I have a tiny office. I'm like, you know, can you help me? And so now he's really advocating for me. And he's also trying to get the district to acknowledge this chapter that I wrote, because he's proud of it, and he's also proud of the, you know, the efforts that we're making for our school, for our students. And so I feel like that kind of buy-in on a smaller scale might help change some policy at the district level for us, I hope.
And that also leads into the question about future collaborations around this work, which is one of the questions here. And it's
Okay, so right now I'm working on a book on minority women in Arizona politics. So I'm focusing my attention on that, because that story needs to be told. Fabiana is one of the women in the book, former tribal chairwoman of the Yaqui Pascua tribe. Thank you for being here. So she's one of our interviewees. So I'm hoping to get that book done, the Minority Women in Arizona Politics. And some of the mayor of Tucson is in that. I mean, it's a great book. It's just that it needs to get finished. And so hopefully I can collaborate with others.
I think the question is more about this current book and extensions of it in different
Oh,
directions.
I need to take a break from this kind of work for a little while. Yeah.
No,
But,
no, we need more of it. You can't leave us now.
Okay, so the younger generations can now do this. Graduate students, go work with children.
Okay, that's the answer. Any other questions from?
Question.
Okay.
My question is in Louisiana. My question is in Louisiana, like many schools, sometimes it's dangerous. Do your kids get bullied, or because I mean they have nobody to talk to other than you?
Yeah, well, we've had some instances like one of the issues that we had is I was really impressed with my school district about this. Is we have a program called ABC, and so our students they have the option of taking classes which are called jumpstart classes, which are like welding and carpentry, being an electrician, plumbing, refrigeration, and so they go to school part-time, and then they can also go to this program, and it's a very expensive program, and all of my students applied. You know, we practiced for their interview, and people from the local businesses come and interview them to see if they qualify. And it was on a day that I wasn't there, but I had a Spanish teacher in there with them to help translate. You know, we had practiced everything. And when I came back, my students said, you know, they asked us if we were illegal. And I was furious. And I was like, no, I was like, you know, are you serious? Did he, you know, how did he ask you? And they're like, si teníamos papeles. And, you know, do we have papers? And I was just like, you know, they can't ask that. And I remember I went to my principal and they're like, well, of course they can ask that, Marissa. They can ask that. You know, they asked that on the application. I said, no, this is a school program. They cannot ask them for papers. They can't ask them if they're legal citizens. I said, you know, that is against the law. And so went up to the superintendent, and he threatened to terminate the program with our parish if anything like that ever happened again. Of course, I was sure to document everything. We've had other incidents of, you know, teachers, you know, saying, did that Mexican kid do it? You know, we've had teachers, with my Palestinian students, that a teacher, you know, didn't want to recognize Palestine. We've had, and students too can be mean. For example, for prom, they played some Spanish music, and all the kids stopped dancing. So yeah, it's tough.
So with that, we're going to end one more. Okay. Since you're here,
You're here, yes, in the audience.
face to in person.
Thank you so much. I appreciated the comment earlier around folks being autonomous individuals. And I'm also thinking about the roots and the pressures that drive people of all ages to have to leave or to choose to leave or feel pressure to leave their home countries or their regions. And I'm curious, from your experience, what kind of work have you been seeing to address the roots?
Okay, so I have a chapter, an article I'm working on looking at the root causes. I've interviewed a lot of people in Ciudad Juárez and in Nogales. And the main reason is el miedo, the fear. El miedo, the gangs, las maras, the military, the police. There's an area in Central America called the Dry Corridor, which is a drought-stricken area, and it's been like this for many, many years. And it doesn't matter what you plant, it doesn't grow. They had no food. That was another reason. Another one is family reunification. I left because my husband has been in Georgia, has been in Nebraska, has been in Arkansas, I mean, it's amazing where these people end up. And they're like, it's time for us to come together. We finally saved the money, and that's why we paid the coyote, and that's why we're here. But el miedo is the most common, and also extortion is another one. And when you ask them el miedo de todo. And then, some of them, I was doing some work at the Casa del Migrante in Juarez. And the staff there is very protective of people because they're saying they're too traumatized to talk to you right now. So they would reconnect me with them once they've been settled and they've been there for a couple of months. And now what I'm finding, and I'm working on this with my colleague in Juarez, many people are now staying in Juarez. Juarez is becoming a city of immigrants, and people are saying the American dream is no more. I'm not going to be able to enter because of Title 42, because of whatever reason. So what do I need to do to stay in Juarez? And the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights has an office. In Spanish, it's Comar, and they're helping people get their kids in school, getting them jobs, getting them a place to live, because they're saying, we're not going back to El Salvador. We're not going back to Honduras. We're not going back to Haiti. There's Cubans in Juarez. There's Haitians in Juarez. There's people from El Salvador, people from Nicaragua, a lot of people from Venezuela. It's complicated, but the drivers of migration is something that we need to study. ASU just got a huge grant because they identified domestic violence as one of the reasons, and they're looking at what do you need to do? What interventions do you need to implement to change that so that women and their families are not forced to flee? So yeah, the root causes, but then, there's this need here for cheap labor. So
I'd like to answer that as well. And I mean, this is just from high school students. There are two very popular people in my classroom. It's Bad Bunny, and it's also Bukele. Bukele seems to have given a lot of students hope about going back to Latin America. And so I always find that interesting that they feel like he's solving a lot of the problems that they left, especially my students from El Salvador.
Yeah, building prisons to put thousands of people in jail. I mean, is that the solution? It's complicated. Anyway, we want to thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your generosity. And again, I'm very appreciative of the University of Arizona. It is my alma mater, and I have a very special place in my heart for it. And Celestino, you and I have been around for a long time too. The University of Arizona had a great program in Guadalajara, and we taught there. Your wife taught there too. It was a lot of fun. Too bad they closed it. But thank you, Javier. It's been wonderful to reunite with you and to be here in this space. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, Marissa and Alejandra.
Thank you for having
their
me.
Presentations. We're gonna say bye to the online audience, and we'll be in contact and follow us on social media. Thank you, everybody, for Facebook Live for the webinar.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was an honor to be here.
And for those here who